Welcome to How to Use Statistical Test, Part 1. We begin by clicking on Statistical Test button from the main menu, and this brings me to the Statistical Test main menu. In Part 1, I would like to look at the one sample test, and in Part 2, two sample test. We'll begin with the one sample z-test. Of course, this is when we're running a hypothesis test. We'll need to know the value associated with the null hypothesis. Let's assume it's 12 for our purposes. Let's also assume that the standard deviation for our sample is 2 and that our sample mean is 11. Let's further assume that we have a sample size of 33 and that we're trying to test whether or not our value is equal to or not equal to. In other words, for the alternative test that we set up, we would have this sign, not equals. You match this sign from the pull down to your sign in your alternative hypothesis. You must do that. I'm testing alternative hypothesis has the sign not equals. I click calculate. I see the z-test statistic that tells me how many standard deviations my value or my mean is from the null value. I also get the p-value, which is the probability that I would be creating a type 1 error if I chose to reject the null hypothesis. There is a help provided for this. You can go to show help, and of course it tells you when you're supposed to be using the z-test and how to reject the null hypothesis. It gives you the rejection rule. If I want to see the graph, I click on graph, and of course here is the graph. I see my p-value is 0.0041. So if you look very closely, you can see just the little edge over here is shaded, and just this little edge over here is shaded very slightly. That's because it's 0.4%. So not much of this curve is going to be shaded. So there's not much of a chance for error here if you rejected the null hypothesis. And that's because you can see from the test statistic our value is very far away from the claimed or from the null value. Let's go back and run a different one of these. Let's do a one sample proportion test. Of course, for a proportion test, the null hypothesis is going to be that the sample proportion is or that the population proportion is a particular value. Let's just say it was 0.25. And let's say that we had 22 successes and we surveyed 77 people. And we want to determine whether or not our probability or proportion, sample proportion, is equal to 0.25. If I wanted not equals, if I wanted greater than or less than, of course I would have to use the pull down button to choose the appropriate sign. I'm going to choose not equals. Again, there is a help. It gives you the formula and verbal description. Let's click calculate. I can see that the test statistic is 0.7237. That means I am not even one full standard deviation away from the null proportion, so I'm pretty close. See, the p-value is 0.4692 and the sample proportion p-hat is 0.2857. So actually I'm trying to decide if 0.2857 is close enough to 0.25. That's what the test was all about. I can click graph, and when I do, I'll see the graph of that. I can see the p-hat is 0.2857. Of course, that would be the center of this, the point estimate. The z-statistic is these values, negative 0.7, positive 0.7237, negative 0.7237. And the p-value, that's the area under the curve, 0.4692. And this ends the session 1 on using statistical test.